I think with the ability to parade our best moments in front of whoever wants to follow us, there's this idea that everything has to be the best.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it just needs to be ordinary, and you need to have a string of ordinary days consistently done. And your children look back and think, wow, I just have great memories of dinner.
Yes.
And they may not remember a particular dinner. And the same thing would be true for education. You get to the end of a year, and if you've consistently done math, well, you've learned a lot of math.
Welcome to Skillets Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Skillets Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me over at afterthoughtsblog.net, spreading my Charlotte Mason joy through blog posts, study guides, audios, and more. My co-host today is Abby Wall. Abby is basically the queen of the Skillets sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. Memory is an essential ingredient in our homeschools. We homeschool moms worry if we're doing it right, if we're doing it enough, if it's going to work at all. Want to sort out your ideas about memory and education? Come to the Skillets Sisters Retreat, Homeschool Essentials, Memory. And rest assured that no matter how imperfect our efforts, they are all worthwhile. After the retreat day, which is basically a homeschool mom in service, you will re-enter your homeschool with renewed vigor and vitality and vision. Go to skilletsisters.com/memory to register. Our guest today is Betsy Farquhar. A Southerner by birth, Betsy currently lives in the Northwest with her Renaissance man husband and their 3 amazing teenagers. She's the managing editor for Redeemed Reader, where she and her team read ahead for you and review new books for children and teens. Betsy learned to make bread with her grandmother at age 11, owns several cast iron skillets, and believes running out of butter is a bona fide emergency. She still calls her mother regularly for advice about dinner and life. This year, as the new year rang in, Betsy and a friend gave themselves a cooking challenge. Cook like it's 1999, which basically means very little internet. Along the way, Betsy has learned about a lot more than cooking. From digital noise to treating the art of educating a bit like a recipe, we think you will love her thoughts. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Skillet Everyday. Abby, you want to start us off?
Yes, I do. I am Abby, and I am currently pre-reading Fast and Furiously to keep ahead of my student, the American literature, novel of James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. So I've never read it before, but my daughter is doing one of IEW's writing through U.S. history. She really enjoys nonfiction writing, and it's such a great system. So that's what we're using. We did kind of the younger version of it, I guess, or the beginner version, and she just flew through it last year. So I got her the advanced one. I think it'll be really good for her. So she is definitely more my person who likes things clearly laid out. She's very good at narration, so I'm not worried about that. But this gives her a little bit more style and structure and things like that. So I'm really happy with it. But we are reading The Last of the Mohicans. We are both doing it on audio. This would bog her down if she had to read it because it's not necessarily easy language. And there's lots of interesting names, indigenous names and tribes and locations. So I just thought that, you know what, the audiobook would be great for this. So it's interesting. And then I did get the movie. And even though it's rated R for, I think, just violence, it's been a long time since I've seen it. I think I'm going to let her watch it because she's old enough and mature. I think we can talk about those things. So that's what we're going to be doing.
I want to know what you think of the book because I haven't read it either.
So far, it's good. Definitely older language. He opens every chapter almost always with Shakespeare or some other thing. So,
really?
Yeah. So James Fenimore Cooper, in the introduction, it talked about how he was reading things and he kept telling his wife, I could write something better. I could write something better, like the modern stuff of his era. And so his wife challenged him. She brought him pen and paper and she says, then do it. And he has a couple of these, I think there's 5 books, and they talk about this Natty Bumppo. And if you've read Peace Like a River, they call the younger son Natty Bumppo as a joke. And he's Hawkeye in this book. So he is the scout who lives with the Indians and things like that.
Interesting.
Huh.
It's kind of this archetype, right? This frontiersman who is nobly living alongside people different from him, but he is, I don't know what it would classify in what ism, but I would say naturalism is probably right, that you can worship God.
Yeah, and a little bit of romanticism.
Yeah, romanticism, definitely. As far as I can tell so far, the Christian characters are behaving as Christians. They treated the Native Americans differently in perspective. Like it wasn't villainized or necessarily elevated, right? I think later on it was elevated, that they were just superior, but it was just a different perspective. So anyway, I listened to another lecture on some of the frontiersmen kind of heroes. And that was one of the distinctions they made. So anyway, it's been interesting. I've enjoyed it so far. So I'm chapter 9 is where I'm at. So I'm still in the first half of the book.
Well, you'll have to give us an update when you're done.
Yes.
Betsy, what about you? What are you up to?
Well, I should be pre-reading, but I'm not. We're also doing American Lit this year, but I'm pre-read up through fall break. So I am reading Jayber Crow, which I've never read before.
Oh.
And I've tried Wendell-Berry before and just kind of stalled out. So I'm part of the local chapter of the Well-Read Mom Book Club. And I just love the book selections. They always make me think. And they're books often that I want to read, but I've never picked up, like in this case, or books that I already love and I'd like to reread. So it's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm almost done.
My daughter's going to read that for her online literature class at the end of the year. So I will be reading that next year as well.
There's been a lot of food for thought, and I don't know. I think it's one of those books that I would think very differently about depending on where I was in my life at that moment.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. It's not a quick read, but it's not a boring one. Lots of things just to chew over and think about.
Well, and it feels you can feel the small town slowness in the way that it's written.
Yes, that's a good description. I would like to read the other novels set in that same community, but they're sort of companion novels, right?
Hannah Coulter's pretty standalone.
Yeah, it is. That's true.
They're in the same community, and I've heard the Coulters mentioned.
Yes.
But it's not like part 2 of the Jayber story or,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love some of the other ones. I can't ever remember the name of the one that is my favorite, actually. It's about a little boy that goes to visit his grandparents. I don't know why I always forget the name. It's not a very well-known one, though, so it never comes up.
Well, there's Andy Catlett, Nathan Coulter, and one more. I don't know.
I think it's Andy Catlett, actually, now that you say that.
Yeah.
So he's I don't know, 9 or 10 probably. Anyway, there's just some interesting quotes that I've gone over and over and over again in my commonplace book that I just love, where he talks about when he's gone, he is reading a book that he's heard his mom read aloud to him, and he reads it in his mother's voice. And there's just some really neat things about boyhood and growing up, and it's a great little.
Yeah, I feel like there's really interesting observations about the seasons of life, or maybe part of it too is because there's a lot of transition in Jayber Crow. And maybe that fits, Abby, with what you were saying about this is kind of a year of flux and transition. Yeah.
Hannah Coulter is the one that impressed me the most, only because I think it's remarkable that a man could write a woman so well. Which I know he has a very good relationship with his wife. They're very, very close. But I was pretty impressed.
That was the one I tried a few years ago, and I just kind of got bogged down and never finished it. So I'll have to try it again.
There's a good audio version of it. I know you're not a big audio book, but it might be one worthwhile listening to in the car with your kids or something.
I like audiobooks with a group, but I tend not to listen to them much by myself.
Yeah.
So
I get that. Well, Mine is Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince.
I love it. Is this your first time reading the Harry Potter books?
Well, yes and no. So we got them in May. So we've never had them before. I've never read them before. My kids had never read them before. So we got them in May. And I was like, I'm reading them first because they're very controversial in Christian communities. So, what is this wickedness I have brought into the house? I read them all. And I mean, the first 3 books, I was like, this is just not that great of writing. Like, I was just not very enthralled. But the last 4, I really liked. And you kind of have to read the first 3 to get to the last 4.
You do.
Anyway, if it had just stayed the way that it was with the first 3, I would be like, well, I can see why people like them, why people read them, but I wouldn't want to read them as an adult. But the last 4 I enjoyed. So
I think some of the later ones could have used some editing.
Yes, I can see that.
There's a little too much.
I could see that.
But I love the series. I've read it several times.
I think what I was mainly judging it by was like with the first 3, 0, like nothing made my commonplace book. I didn't walk away feeling like there was anything worth thinking about afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the general themes of like good versus evil and that kind of stuff. But versus with the other ones, there actually were things that were worth writing down. Mm-hmm. And that's not the only way to judge a book, but it's an easy way to do it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this one is the only one that I'm reading aloud to the kids. And it's just because I don't love the way the kissing is dealt with. It's not the kissing, by the way. I had this conversation with a younger mom the other day, and I was like, no, it's not that they are kissing. It's that there's this like back and forth about like, well, you're criticizing this because you're not as experienced as like, there's this thing about being experienced and about how you would just understand if you had more experience. I don't know. Like, I just hate that kind of thing. And it's never corrected. That's the thing.
Yeah.
I think it wouldn't have bothered me if someone was like, well, that's not like how you live your life. Anyway, I just was like, you know what? I'm going to read this one aloud. And then that way my 12-year-old isn't being exposed to some of these bad ideas. So that was the only one that I pulled and read aloud. They're reading the rest of them on their own. I could have a very long discussion about the idea of magic and all that kind of stuff. It's been very interesting because they start talking about Voldemort as a tyrant in book 6. So that's been interesting, just considering the current events.
Yeah. I love the ending to the series, not the epilogue. I mean, that's fine, but the just prior to the epilogue. But one of my problems with the first few books, especially, is I just kept feeling like there were no consequences for Harry's disobedience.
Yes.
He was not suffering.
Yes.
And suddenly in book 4, that really turns a corner.
Yeah.
There's a big maturity jump, I feel like.
For sure.
He does eventually suffer. And not that I want him to suffer, but I just felt like he's violating all the rules and just getting away with it.
Right. Well, and that was like, I did have a conversation with my younger ones, especially before they read it. Younger, they're not that young, about that, because I was like, I don't actually usually have books in the house that show that kind of thing, benefiting from doing wrong things.
Right.
But you're right. It does change as the series goes on. But it was funny because, I mean, I think it was like book 2 or something. My youngest looks up at me and was like, it bothers me how much lying is in these books. And I was like, oh, I know. It's true. So it's made for some good conversations, for sure.
Hi, Abby here to give you an inside look into the community we call the Sistership. It is the place for homeschooling moms to gather and engage in meaningful and fruitful conversation. If you've ever found yourself listening to the podcast and wanting to join the conversation, discuss the ideas presented, or ask a question, then join us inside Sistership. That is where we go in depth and extend the conversation to include all of you. We are passionate about reclaiming and pursuing our own education, and we know that real education happens best in community. Sistership is the place to find your sisters. We have a feature that allows you to search for people near you. We want homeschooling moms to connect locally, and Sistership is here to help. We are fond of saying that friends don't let friends read alone, and we have an active and engaged online community if people in your local area haven't joined yet. Together, we read widely, think deeply, and apply faithfully the educational philosophy and good and great books. So join today.
Let's move on and talk about what we're really here about, which is cooking like it's 1999.
Yeah, that's right.
you sure I can't call you Betsy Crocker?
So my mom's name is Betty.
For real?
Yeah. So if you want to call me Betsy Crocker, you can, but I'm going to deny it.
Well, you and your friend came up with a very interesting challenge for this whole year, right?
Correct.
So I would love for us to just start off with you telling the backstory behind this, because this is just fascinating to me.
So in December, as many people do, I was trying to think through New Year's resolutions, goals, that sort of thing. And the thing I really wanted to address in my life was digital noise. I manage a website. Of course, there's all kinds of things we do online now that are legitimate. I bank online, all these things. So I was just trying to think through what are the areas in my life that have excess digital noise that I can actually address. Mm-hmm. I can't really manage a website without being online. Right. Mm-hmm. So I came up with cooking because I was just thinking I'm spending dumb time online. My brain is atrophying when I'm using the web for cooking. So I was talking about this with my friend Bridget. We really got close when our boys were babies 14 years ago. And one of the things that really bonded us was cooking together. We just kind of cut our eye teeth on how to cook for a family together, even to having freezer meal cooking days together. We shared recipes. So she was a natural person to talk about this with. And she was simultaneously trying to find a way to save time menu planning. We both have 3 kids. She teaches high school science. Like we both are busy. Mm-hmm. So this is not about spending hours in the kitchen. It's about doing this part of our job better. So together, we decided we were going to spend a year just with our cookbooks. Well, a year without the internet helping us cook. And so, of course, we had to define some parameters. We chose Cook Like It's 1999 because, well, the song. But I have a recipe that my mother emailed me in 1999. So we know the internet was around and people could email recipes. But in 1999, if you went online for a recipe, you went to a particular website like Epicurious, or
right.
You weren't browsing food blogs. You were not browsing, not like you are now. And you weren't reading reviews and all of the delights.
Well, listening to her talk about her dog help her find the perfect cilantro at the farmer's market.
For real. And wading through 50 ads, and then you get a Facebook notification or an email comes through. So we decided, we're allowed to use the internet if we've exhausted our other resources.
Oh, so you are allowed. Okay.
Yes, but under certain parameters. Okay. It has to be a pretty specific need, because the internet existed in 1999, but it needs to be like, I need to know how to can some peaches. None of my cookbooks have this recipe, but I know the Ball canning jar website has directions. I could go there and find that out, because it is the 21st century. That's a resource. But the flip side is I'm not going to Google how to can peaches and spend 3 hours reading about all these amateurs and canning peaches.
I see.
So that was kind of how we launched the challenge. And then right away, January 1st, I'm making an appetizer for a football game party we were going to. And I made it from a cookbook. It was amazing. It was a good Southern classic appetizer. And I decided I need to share this recipe with my mother. I get online to see if I could find the same recipe online, because then I could send her the link, right? 30 minutes later, I'm like, how many recipes exist for this appetizer that are different from mine? And it just kind of crystallized the whole year, because I thought, I could literally take a picture with my phone and text my mother the actual recipe. And that took me approximately 30 seconds. And that's really kind of the crux of the issue. We're not content with what's in front of us, or we feel this need to find out what other people are doing or how did they make it, when we liked the version I made and right. I had that actual recipe. So that's kind of our challenge. And of course, like good 21st century chefs, we were going to Instagram this challenge. Which the irony. I know. And then that kind of fizzled, because it just became such a part of our lives that it's not a novelty anymore to be using our cookbooks. So we don't Instagram about it anymore.
Okay. So I'm curious, has this put you at a disadvantage in some way? Like, have you had bumps in the road, or has she, or has it all been just this great experience?
It's all been sunshine and roses, Brandy.
I thought so. I had this feeling. You've discovered the magic elixir for life.
We did. Since we've allowed ourselves the desperate access, I think if we had ruled out the internet 100%, it would have been a lot harder. She makes special St. Patrick's Day treats every year. And the recipe she normally makes wasn't going to work for allergy reasons this year. And so she got on and Googled a particular kind of candy. Those kind of things would be tricky if you were limited just to your cookbooks, but that's such a small amount of instances. They're pretty isolated like that, or like the canning peaches example.
Yeah.
That I don't really feel like we've been at a disadvantage. In fact, I would say by the end of January, we were having all these Marco Polo conversations. Like, I love cooking again. And we'd get on and it was like we were doing our own cooking shows. Look what I'm making tonight. And I forgot all about this recipe. We both almost immediately were enjoying cooking more and were more relaxed. We were making old favorites we'd forgotten about, trying things in cookbooks that we'd wanted to try, and just kind of gotten sidetracked from. Her menu planning, she is loving her current system. I don't know that we'll go back. I really think it's been a lifestyle change.
So how did this change her menu planning?
It's just that creativity within limits idea. She's got her favorite recipes or her favorite cookbooks. And instead of browsing for possibilities, you already really know what your possibilities are. Maybe you need a crock pot meal because you're going to be gone all day. Maybe you need something quick and easy because you're running out to a ball game afterwards. Whatever is in your schedule that's going to kind of dictate, the demands on your dinner. Those you already know. And if you're at all familiar with your cookbooks, you can usually come up with ideas pretty quickly. You're not reinventing the wheel each week. And it's not like you're reading every cookbook.
Right.
You're thinking, I need something in the crock pot. Well, I have that great crock pot recipe for pulled pork. And so you go get it, and that's what you make.
So Betsy told me about this challenge, and I automatically saw that it was a brilliant idea. So I totally jumped on board. I'm not being as strict because no one's holding me accountable, which is good. But it made me go to the library. Well, not go to the library at that time, but I requested books from the library. And some of the books that I trust are America's Test Kitchen. So
yes.
They have everything specific, allergy, one pot meals, all these different things. And then they have these ones that are called like family cookbooks, and they're, 1,000 pages thick, and they have every recipe under the sun. I made a delicious Irish stew, lamb stew from there, because I will tell you, lamb recipes are few and far between. And then when you go on the internet, they're just not great. The only lamb recipe that I highly recommend is the New York Times leg of lamb, where you use anchovy paste to cover the outside because it gives this most delicious salty flavor.
For real?
Yes. It is amazing. Anyway, Betsy did this. And she also said that you could email your friends recipes, or they could do it, or you could call your mom or your sister or other things like this. So I told my sister about this, and she is 12 years younger than me. So she is fully, in the digital. She never grew up without that access. And she thought it was such a great idea. And so we exchanged recipes and we talked about it. She came down one Sunday afternoon, and she had made a bunch of this special pizza crust because she is celiac and one of my kids is gluten-free. And so she made this amazing recipe of pizza crust that was from a friend of my mom's. And it's just amazing how we forget how connected cooking is and how it connects us. I would vox Betsy about recipes, and she'd send me a half dozen of them. Like, well, what about this one? What about this one? Right. And so we started getting creative and still using technology, but it's just in a more relational manner.
So I asked my family yesterday in preparation for today, like, what have you guys noticed? And that's something my husband brought up. He said, when we depend on the internet for cooking, we lose all these threads. So his birthday cake is his grandmother's pound cake.
Wow.
We will never deviate. I tried when we were newlyweds. I was like,
did you get in trouble?
Plain. Don't you want like a cream cheese pound cake? Or, nope, we want the plain. My birthday cake is my great grandmother's recipe.
Really?
And, it's like when we start looking for the better recipe or somebody else's version, we lose those. We make my grandmother's cornbread. There's all these little anchors in our cooking repertoire that come from family. There's recipes that we make that make us think of friends, because I got this from so-and-so. It is kind of fun to recapture that. I think I did not realize how much we had lost of those parts of cooking.
That's interesting. I feel like we don't have a ton of family recipes. Mainly because my one grandma that cooked a lot, she was like the entertainer in the family, never wrote anything down. And she did everything from memory. So now we try to nail her down and she's like, well, I don't know. And she can't see. So she can't rummage around her shelves. And I feel like I missed the opportunity. 10 years ago, I should have interrogated over all the holiday recipes and stuff. And I didn't think to do it.
So I have my grandmother's recipe boxes. When she
Wow.
died, that's what I got. But I have to tell you, some of them are not very helpful because it'll say things like bake in a hot oven till done. And I'm like, well, there's a little bit of range there. So I've had to do a little recipe testing on some of those.
Interesting.
And sometimes they call for ingredients that we don't use anymore, like a cake of yeast instead of instant or dry yeast.
Oh, yeah.
Or lard. I mean, some of them are pretty easy swaps, right? Or they'll call for a box of something and the packaging is different now.
Oh.
So it's kind of tricky.
Do you think a challenge like this could be done by people who are not great cooks and don't have a lot of experience? I mean, because you guys sound like very experienced cooks to me. Well, and you've been married a long time. So you've been providing food for a family for a long time.
I think you could, because when I first got married, I didn't have a smartphone. We didn't have internet at our house.
We didn't either.
I did the old fashioned, hey, Mom, how do you cook a pot roast? Walk me through this. And I had a few cookbooks. Bridget and I both agree you've got to have a couple of workhorse cookbooks. We like Mark Bittman's How to Cook Everything for Ordinary. I have to get something on the table tonight with what's in my house. That's our favorite cookbook for that purpose. But our favorite cookbook for entertaining would be the Cook's Illustrated. It's enormous because every recipe works in there.
Oh,
you can serve it for
interesting.
entertaining without having to worry about it. So finding kind of your workhorse cookbooks that will explain the process enough, and then you just kind of experiment. It's not going to knock it out of the park every night, but that's okay.
Yeah, my mom gave me, I think it was just Better Homes and Gardens, their anthology, and
Yeah.
it has solid recipes.
Yeah.
It has a little bit of everything, but it's not so overwhelming. It has 2 options for oatmeal raisin cookies,
Right.
not
Mhm.
18.
I have a Better Homes and Gardens too that I got when I first was cooking.
Yeah, it's just solid, straightforward, and not a lot of weird ingredients or complicated methods. And I appreciated that. I actually really like magazines. I know that's kind
do
of
too.
old school, but I actually really love cooking magazines. Pioneer Woman has great recipes. We now have a family tradition of what we call cheesy potatoes, and I've adapted it a little bit because who has time to mandolin potatoes for a crowd of 50? So we use hash browns and it's delicious. I actually really love Pioneer Woman. I mean, it's not health food at all, but if you want a good, solid, home-cooked meal, it is one of my go-tos.
Well, and her stuff is filling.
Yes.
So it's good for serving to teenage boys.
Well, and I just feel like she understands me as a, ranch person where people eat way more than most people. So my kids are huge eaters, and especially when we need to, when we're working and doing stuff. So, yeah.
Well, and another part of learning to cook. So my friend Bridget and I learned to cook together. I taught other friends how to make biscuits. There's really no substitute for being with somebody if you really don't know how to do something. And that's a great way to build relationships with people in your church.
Yes.
I mean, you could watch a YouTube video or something. I took a cooking class with my sister, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, somewhere in there. We did it at Williams-Sonoma in the mall, and we learned it was all souffles. So it was like,
wow.
6 souffles in one night or something like that. I forget. It wasn't a huge time commitment, but we learned a ton from an actual class with an actual person.
My neighbor, she and I had kids at the same age, but she's Mennonite. And so they are big on canning and preserving. So she taught me how to make the best spicy dill pickles ever. And I still make
so
them
good.
every year. Yes. I give them away as gifts. And she also taught me how to do simple tomato sauces and salsa. it was such a great thing because she made it so unintimidating, because canning can be. And then you read some of these people like, oh, you're going to kill people because you're going to give them botulism. And she's like, that's ridiculous. We've never done that. Like, you're fine. And it was just so great. And so I still use the techniques. I've canned tuna with my other neighbors. Canning is a great way to get together with your neighbors, and then everybody does it. And then you all go home with a beautiful pantry.
That's how I learned to make salsa. This woman who was kind of a mentor of mine, we made salsa with mostly her garden stuff, but it would be an afternoon affair. And then of course dinner was chips, salsa, and beer.
Nice.
We just sat around but it was such a great memory, and it taught me a lot about canning.
Yes.
In addition to what I like in terms of how it tastes, what kind of salsa do I like? So I think that's a big part of learning to cook too, is what do you like? We have a guacamole recipe that I leave certain things out and add other things in because that's what we like.
That's a good point. What I've noticed, once I know what spices my family likes, I can identify a recipe that will probably work.
Yeah.
Like I know certain people in my family do not like dill. I like dill.
Well, then I'll give you some pickles, Brandy.
Well, that would probably convert them, right?
Yeah.
It might. They're pretty amazing.
But so that means I'm not making like a recipe that's totally full of it, especially as a main dish, because that might be mean.
So our favorite chicken soup is a Moldovan chicken soup that has dill in it. And we were just discussing it last night.
That sounds good to me. I like that though. So it's picky people. What can I say? So this is a classical education show. And I feel like people are like, so is this a cooking show now? It's not. So I want to try to bring this beyond cooking to applying this to things that we talk about here on School A Sisters all the time. Things like how education affects our relationships when it's done one way versus another way. What's the relationship between this and things like restful learning? I feel like there's a lot of ways we could go with this, but I'm wondering first, are there principles behind this approach that you think we could extrapolate beyond cooking to something like, say someone is just like, I'm not into cooking, so I don't care. I feel like there's more to this than just cooking. Like this has a lot of possibilities.
I think so too. I think the easy connection is between any other craft that takes that combination of art or creativity and an actual skill. My husband likes to do woodworking. So that would be another example. You could spend all day watching YouTube videos of other people making things in their shops.
That's true.
Or you could get a trusted resource, and that may be a YouTube person who knows what they're doing, or it might be a set of plans from Fine Woodworking or some other resource, and then actually build something in your own shop. I think it's so easy right now in our culture to pursue novelty for novelty's sake and watch what other people are doing instead of honing your own craft. So whether it's sewing or any kind of handicraft that grownups engage in would fit. I also think, so I'm an educator. I've always taught school or worked with children even before my own arrived. So I've been thinking about it in terms of education. I caught myself this week because I'm so late on my planning this year, thinking I need to come up with a rubric for this writing assignment that my students have to turn in the first day of school. I'm teaching to more than just my own children for my literature class. I have taught English before, but what do? I think I could get online and find a rubric. And I caught myself and I thought, no, that's the same thing that I was doing with cooking. Instead, I should spend 15 minutes creating one that meets the needs of my students. I already have good resources in the house that I've used before. I might have to adapt them, but that would be better serving my students, me using my brain instead of depending on groupthink. So I think if you think of cooking and break it down to its component parts, what are your ingredients or your resources that you have that you are working with? What resources do you have that will help you learn how to do it better? And then practice.
What do you think is behind the looking around that we do? Like, do you think it's just because we can, or do you think it's always been a temptation? I'm trying to think of like, did my mom spend too much time worrying about what other people were doing? I don't think that she did.
So the 10 commandments include don't covet.
True.
So we know that part of this is human nature. It's part of the sin nature we have. But the internet makes it so much easier. And there's just so much more. And if you think about people who have blogs or websites or Instagram followings or whatever, they're all competing to rise to the top of those algorithms. And so they're just shouting louder and making it prettier and more appealing than maybe our neighbors did in their front yards. Like maybe you're coveting your neighbor's roses, but that would be one neighbor's roses. You weren't scrolling through thousands of pictures of rose gardens done by professionals.
So the internet allows us to make it large scale.
I think so. And I think the internet allows people to only portray the best, you know.
True.
Here's my little schoolroom. And they're not showing you that their laundry room is a disaster and 3 days worth of dishes are in the kitchen.
Right.
You're just seeing this lovely schoolroom.
Or even if they do show those things, you also can get into the comparison game. Well, like, at least my house isn't that bad, right? Like,
well, that's
you
true.
Pat yourself on the back. But I've quoted this before, and it's, I think it was a Nobel Prize winner. I can't remember his name right now, but he won it in the 1970s. And it's a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And I think that that's what it is. It's the distraction, right?
Yeah.
And you get sucked into rabbit holes, right?
Totally.
I do think that this is really good. Asking a friend or using what you have is something that we should all start with when we are curating homeschooling resources. Because I mean, almost every single resource that I have bought because of a good sales page or because I thought this would solve a problem almost never works. But the things that my friends have actually used and given me their stamp of approval, those are almost always more successful for me. It's covetousness, right? Like, well, I'll just get this thing and it'll make things better. And the reality is using what I already have and perhaps, buying some good books, but really thinking that this is something I'm going to use and apply and practice with, like you were saying, Betsy, like actually do, rather than just peruse and keep going down this rabbit hole of finding the perfect solution.
I think too, with the ability to parade our best moments in front of whoever wants to follow us, there's this idea that everything has to be the best. And sometimes it just needs to be ordinary, and you need to have a string of ordinary days consistently done. And your children look back and think, wow, I just have great memories of dinner.
Yes.
And they may not remember a particular dinner. And the same thing would be true for education. You get to the end of a year, and if you've consistently done math, well, you've learned a lot of math.
True.
Maybe no individual lesson was amazing. So I think we spend so much time looking for the better thing when it's like the difference between a 96% and a 98%. If you can get a 96%, then why are we spending 3 times the amount of time for that extra 2%?
That was such the debate I had with my husband in college because he worked so hard. And I was like, I'm going to the beach.
Me too. I was at the beach, but I was like, well, I'm already getting an A, so
right.
I'm going to go hike. Like, live a full life. There's more to life than school.
Oh, I so relate to that.
Well, that's that work-leisure balance, right?
Right.
Right.
That is hard to achieve. And for some people, it's even harder because, achievement is something. I think there's some personalities out there that it does come more naturally. So I'm looking at you, Peas.
But I think part of the temptation for any of these areas we've talked about is to make that the main thing.
Yes.
Right.
My life as a homeschool educator, or my role, my vocation as a homeschool educator, is just one of my vocations. Sometimes my limit of time and other callings, that is my limit. So for instance, for me this year, I have always taken great pride in crafting an amazing curriculum for my children. And this year, I was given access to a video course. And last week, this is how unprepared I am this year, but I thought, you know what? If I don't have time to plan, I need to accept that and take advantage of this good resource. And maybe I could spend days and days and days and days and marginally improve it, or I could be content with this good resource and move on.
Yep.
We'll have a great year. That's what we need.
So contentment would be one of the principles, not always trying to seek out the best, but
well,
Yeah.
and that's interesting because I did want us to discuss the relationship between this and restful learning, because it certainly sounds like you have lowered your stress level when it comes to this area of your life. But I hadn't considered when we were talking beforehand to talk about what we were going to talk about.
the metacognition, right?
Exactly. That wasn't anything that popped into my head during that time. This idea that maybe underlying restful learning is, I was going to say contentment, but almost like just an acceptance of, especially of the 96%, because it's not like you're saying, let's all go out and get an F on cooking. Like, you're not saying that at all. It's just, we don't have to win at cooking. It's not a competition anyway, but it could feel like it if you're on the internet too much. You really lowered your stress while still doing the work. When we kind of look out in our culture, there's this movement towards, if you could just get rid of your stress, everything would be great. Those of us with families are thinking, well, how do you do that when you don't live in a vacuum? Because life is stressful. It just is. Mm-hmm. And yet you have the normal stress of life. You have the normal stress of meals need to be made, things need to be done. But it seems like you've subtracted, I don't know if it's like an unnecessary level of stress or something.
I think you're onto something with the idea of acceptance, because we don't want to be content in the sense that we never improve or strive to learn more. We don't want to be complacent.
Right.
But I think accepting your limits and your ingredients, as it were, it's very freeing to be present in your particular situation. There's a character in Jayber Crow, Maddie, I think her maiden name is Maddie Keith. She's kind of a big figure. And I really loved the description of her as being present as Jayber's reflecting on her. He's thinking about her trials and her struggles, but he says you would never know it. She's not complaining. She's being faithful in her work, and she's enjoying the things that there are to enjoy. And I think that's part of it too. So often we feel like we're caught in a hamster wheel instead of just, it's easy to say, step off the wheel and go have a cup of coffee on your back porch. But sometimes that's what acceptance is doing, right? Is recognizing I can't get it all done today. Yeah. I can't. I would be better served by taking a walk with this child who's obviously falling apart than trying to do all the things.
Well, and there's the proverb, and I don't know where it is in Proverbs, but it's better a meal of herbs where there is, maybe it's joy or peace, than feasting where there is strife or stress. I mean, maybe sometimes it is better for a box of macaroni and cheese to grace your table. Things happen, and you need quick, easy meals to feed your family, and it doesn't have to be a feast every night, right?
Right. It doesn't have to be pretty and all together.
I mean, and my mom did a great job she's an excellent cook, but she was a working mom. And so, not every meal was gourmet, but we almost always sat down to meals. And I do remember that. And that is the thing I remember. Sometimes it was bowls of cereal because you know what? Lots of kids love cereal. So it doesn't have to be a feast, but I remember I have good memories of tables. And I remember also feasting with my family around a huge table. And those are great memories. And everybody helping in the kitchen with those things. It was such a great way.
So I'm wondering about this, bringing this back to things like homeschooling and educating. What are the unhealthy stresses that you think we put on those things? And is there some sort of parallel that we could use to remove them?
I think one of the unhealthy things we do, I cannot be the only one suffering from this. Let me say it that way. When I see what my friends are doing with their kids, because I respect my friends, you see somebody post a book. Hey, we're going to read this book. And you think, well, I should read that book too with my kids because it's an amazing book. And it's that idea of constantly adding in all the good things. Sometimes you just can't. You cannot do all the good things. When it comes to homeschooling, there are so many bright, shiny objects out there. And there are new methods and new techniques and new tools and new curricula. But that's not necessary. They can be helpful, but I think we're much better served by studying our children and our environment, our needs, and Am I moving this year? Is there a new baby coming? All these big things that might skew your environment. Am I caring for an aging parent? What is it? And then what are my children like? What do they need? And then going to look for the things that will fit those needs, not starting with all of the options. That's kind of what we've done with cooking. We flipped it around. If there's a really particular need, then I will go find something for that need. But I'm not just browsing all the options and starting there. I'm starting with what my family needs. Here's a quick example. One of my sons is having minor dental surgery this week. And so when I was making my meal plan, I'm like, we need soft food that night. I don't know what he's going to feel like. That's my family's need for dinner. So then I think, well, what's going to fit that need? Instead of me looking at all the possible meal ideas first.
Right.
So I think that would be one thing, just to study our own families and pay attention to our environment before we pay attention to everybody else's.
I think that is why I like buying curriculum versus building my own, even though I end up building my own. in many ways. I mean, just because, we all tailor everything we buy or whatever.
Right.
But I think some of it is because I never thought about this before, but it just like, I trust the people who wrote AO, which is the curriculum I use. And it's good enough. Like, is there a curriculum out there who is better at X? Probably. But it's like, it works for me. And then I don't have to spend, because I'm a researcher, I would spend all summer looking at every single great book that was ever written and every single good book that was ever written and thinking through all of them. And it would take a million years and probably wouldn't be any better than just taking the AO plan and tweaking it to fit our family. Anyway, it just dawned on me that I wonder if that's what the appeal is for me. Like, I never really thought about it. It was just like, it works. So that's what I'm doing. But actually,
and I think there's nothing wrong with the research or the browsing through recipes or any of those things. But I think you have to keep in mind the whole picture. Is this a good use of my time, given the other things the Lord has called me to do? And sometimes that may be what you need to be doing, is helping devise a new curriculum because this is your need. And sometimes it's, that's not what I have time for right now because the Lord has put other things on my plate. And thankfully, he's also given me good resources.
Right. It's interesting to me how you talk about resources and ingredients. Are your ingredients your students, you think?
I think you could look at your students as your ingredients. And then I think you could look at your curriculum as your tools.
So kind of your resources then.
Not that that breaks down a little bit because I'm not doing things to my children. But when you think of cooking, your menu is going to depend on your ingredients, right? Your ultimate goal is going to depend on what's available. And part of that, I mean, your students, that's who you have. Maybe the students are your kitchen. But, it has to do with looking at what's in front of you. Yeah. So I guess when I think of resources, I think more of the books about education.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I would use my cookbooks. They're not going to do the work for me, but they're going to give me some really good guidance on how to make pancakes or whatever.
Right. Well, I like what you're saying about the ingredients determine the menu because, I mean, that's kind of what you're saying about school, right? It doesn't matter what your curriculum said. If your child's having dental surgery, you're going to have to make some adjustments.
Right.
So.
Right. Maybe the idea is that we need to hold all these things loosely. We need to be flexible and always keep in mind, what has the Lord given me today? What is he calling me to today? Because we all have had days where, you get a phone call and somebody is at the hospital or somebody needs to drop their kid off or whatever is happening to change your day.
Right.
Or your week or, So just kind of recognizing that you're doing your work within those constraints and you have to be accepting of that. I'm going to have to re-listen to this when I start chafing at my constraints. Preach to myself, right?
Yes.
Oh, seriously. It's funny how things can come out of our mouths that are they sound so good. And then, then it's you completely forget it when everything falls apart the next week. Or at least that happens to me.
I do think though that for me, because I love to plan things. I love to dream up ideas. So it's been really good for me to have the seasons where I don't have time for those and to realize that's right. The less than plan is only marginally less than, and it's the perfect plan for right now.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking too, as you were talking, Betsy, there is a temptation to switch things midstream. But if we did that with a recipe, it would not probably end well, right? I mean, if you were starting with one recipe and did all these things, and then you decided to change it up, I mean, it could be a total disaster. And I think oftentimes we will do that with curriculum, right? Like, this is not working. We're just done. Instead of maybe just like, okay, let's actually give this a try for a couple months and then we'll see, right? We're not actually losing any time.
The first thing I thought of when Abby was talking about combining two things was that Friends episode where Rachel was making trifle and the cookbook pages got stuck together. Yes. So there's meat and jelly. And we quote that line all the time, meat, good. But I think all good chefs are going to tweak their recipe. You're tasting for salt. You're going to make adjustments.
Absolutely.
Maybe you cook it longer because your oven is slow, or maybe you burned it and you start over.
Yes.
But you don't completely jump ship.
Yeah.
And sometimes you phone a friend, like Domino's and I, we are tight.
Well, that's because you live close enough to town. We don't have any.
It's true.
Systems. Or at least if we do now, it would cost more. It would be ridiculous.
Right.
So. Yes.
My coworker or my colleague, Megan, wrote a post last summer comparing homeschooling to serving dinner.
Oh.
And I thought about that a lot, thinking about today's conversation, because her point was just serve dinner. It comes back to that idea of doing the work. They need nourishment every night for dinner. And that needs to happen, even though it's not going to be gourmet every night. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And the same thing is true for homeschooling. And she was talking about all these resources, very similar to the conversation we were just having. We can buy all these different resources, but at the end of the day, we have to do the work. We just serve dinner. We show up. That's a lot of it, isn't it? Just show up.
It really is. Well, and then I think about the temptation we were talking about to do the looking around online. And I wonder if some of that also, for me at least, like I wonder if some of that is a way of escaping the work or avoiding it or feeling like I've done it because I watched someone else do it. All those are possibilities.
Well, because it was research. You were researching.
Yeah, totally. It totally was.
There's a Bible story that goes along with this, with a verse. So it's in First Chronicles, and it's talking about Solomon, and it's David talking to him about building the temple. And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every desire and every thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen you to build a house as a sanctuary. Be strong and do the work. David also said to his son Solomon, be strong and courageous and do the work. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord is God. My God is with you. He will not fail you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the temple of the Lord is finished.
Well, and Megan and I, the same one who wrote that article, this is from Exodus. The Lord is talking to Moses, and he asks Moses, what do you have in your hand? It's from Exodus 4, verse 2. And we often ask each other that. So God has called you to this work. What do you have in your hand before you go buy stuff? And sometimes what do you have in your hand might be a person. Like I have a great resource who might be able to teach my children Algebra 2 instead of me. That's what I have in my hand. That's a resource. But sometimes it might be, the book I have on my shelf that's a great story that's better than finding another read aloud that I don't already own. So I think that to myself a lot. What do I have in my hand? What has the Lord already given me?
That's a great question. I hope you're going to give us the link for that article so we can put it in the show notes for everyone.
I did. I just emailed you.
Oh, great. Look at you using technology during a recording.
I know.
Good job. Because that's on Redeemed Reader. For those of you who don't know that Betsy's on Redeemed Reader. Or you manage Redeemed. What are you called? What is your title?
I am the managing editor.
Managing editor. I knew it was something fancy, which is why I couldn't remember.
Which is just code for having to do all the work nobody else wants to do.
Oh, that totally makes sense to me. avoid fancy titles for that reason.
I just want to be a writer.
Yep, I hear you. Well, any parting encouragement for moms from either of you, really, before we go?
Well, I know Abby's doing a study on Sarah's book, Teaching from Rest. And I think those kinds of things are such great ways to start the school year. What do we have in our hand? What work has God called me to do? And then just trust the process, right? I don't need a shinier object. I need to do the work. And not in a drudgery sense, but choosing to enjoy what's in front of you, which is hard to do in the minutia sometimes.
I have a motto that I like to say.
Ooh.
The grass is greener where I water it.
Nice.
It is very helpful to me when I see shiny objects because, that whole phrase of the grass is greener on the other side. Actually, it's greener where I water it.
So we used to say the grass is greener on the other side of the fence, but it still has to be mowed. So same kind of idea, right? There's still work involved, still maintenance.
All we say is the grass is greener and they have a high water bill. So that probably doesn't work so well.
I love it.
On that note. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This was actually, I was telling you this on Voxer too, that it's just given me a lot to think about as we're going into the homeschool year. And I feel like people are looking for encouragement early in the year this year. Like, I think a lot of people are starting out kind of weighed down by things that have been going on and things that happened, like even just personal things that happened over summer that kind of tripped them up over summer. And it's really encouraging, I think, to get back to the basics of thinking in this sense. God has given me a good work to do and I can do it. And there's ways of doing it that will actually do for me what this challenge has done for you. Restoring where the relationship has broken down a little bit. I feel like that's really what I'm taking away from this. Sometimes when the relationship breaks down, it's because my approach has been itself sort of destructive to the process. It's not helping anymore. The internet's not helping anymore.
Well, it's been good for me to think through. I mean, like I said, Bridget, my friend Bridget and I've been having these kinds of conversations because we were just amazed at how it was a relatively simple change. Wow, getting away from all the noise, all the information.
Yeah.
And doing the work and choosing to enjoy, what do I like about this? What do I like to make?
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you both for coming. I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the Sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. All of the books and things mentioned in today's episode are linked in our show notes. Just go to skolasisters.com/SS94 to check it out. Remember, our fall retreat is all about memory. Will we cover ideas about memory work? Yes. Will we cover the topic far beyond those narrow bounds? Also, yes. Head on over to skolasisters.com/memory, register, and prepare to think about memory like never before. In our next episode, the four of us, Misty, Abby, Pam, and me, are chatting about that classical hot topic, teaching virtue. Is classical education a promise that we will all graduate perfect children? And if it isn't, why would we ever say virtue is a goal of education? This was such a fun conversation to have, and we look forward to sharing it with you. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon you needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters.
My husband is calling me and he is forgetting that I have things going on. So can you excuse me?
I feel
He's
like
just going to keep calling me.
Wouldn't be a podcast unless something like this happened to Abby.